Is this more evidence of the hints given in recent shows? Australia has imposed a blanket ban on arrivals from India, with those daring to violate it facing jail time and heavy fines. And the move has been met with criticism, but the government insists it's needed to protect public health, which is a misnomer in and of itself. Now, the controversial rule which came into force on Monday, barring Australian citizens from returning to the country from the COVID-19 hotspot until May 15th. Those who ignore the restrictions face 5 years in jail and or a fine of 66,600 Australian dollars. 666. Followed by two numbers that have no value, 00. And it's a high-risk situation, Health Minister Greg Hunt said. I thought his name was Mike, personally. Said during a televised news briefing on Monday there has been no doubt in any of the Commonwealth advice about this measure or other measures, and the travel ban has been supported by the country's Chief Medical Officer, Paul Kelly, who has admitted that the restrictions may result in the deaths of Australians who are forced to remain in India. Nice to see a country looking after their own people. Speaking to one of the members this week, I was made aware of border closures within Canada. Not just between America and Canada, no, between province to province as well. Imagine if they implemented that in the States. Might cancel a few of my trips. But this got me thinking, something that many of us maybe are thinking but perhaps reluctant to recognise, that the world has entered an era of closed borders and restricted travel. And the great question is, will this new age of isolationism, and will it last years, maybe decades? Now, the fake COVID-19 pandemic that has triggered the closure of many borders, but will this herald a national lockdown of restricted travel to enable each country to become self-sufficient? Oops. Remember, the dark forces have been using international travel as a means to mix the races, create unrest in selected regions, and destroy economies in the past. Perhaps that will all stop now these restrictions are in place, unless they feel the Trojan horse is already in place. The federal government is working with the Georgia-based company that shut down a major pipeline transporting fuel across the East Coast after a ransomware attack, according to the White House. And the government is planning for various scenarios and working with state and local authorities on measures to mitigate any potential supply issues, according to officials on Saturday. And the attack is unlikely to affect gasoline supply and prices, it says, unless, it's always a but or an unless, it leads to a prolonged shutdown, experts said, or non-experts said. The Colonial, or very Crown, pipeline did not say what was demanded or who made the demand. Now, ransomware attacks are typically carried out by criminal hackers, CIA, NSA, who scramble data Excuse me while I have a drink. I've got a intelligence agency in my throat. Who scramble data. Isn't that called encryption? Paralyzing victim networks and demand a large payment to decrypt it. Well, I never. Now, the attack on the company, which says it delivers roughly 45% of fuel consumed on the East Coast, underscores again the vulnerabilities of critical infrastructure to damaging cyber attacks that threaten to impede operations. And it said it presents a new challenge for an administration still dealing with its response to major hacks from months ago, including a massive breach of government agencies and corporations, for which the US sanctioned Russia last month. Well, I'd never. Russia. It's always Russia, isn't it? And prices unaffected unless a prolonged shutdown, they said. Really. As the lockdown winds down and people get back in their cars, here is the excuse for increased gas prices right on cue. And it's also predictable. But you would think the American public would have worked that out by now. Another target perhaps for the communal activism group. Every summer, the gas prices go up a fair chunk to collect more taxes that don't get spent on the American people. I watched a short interview this week with an Israeli lawyer, and he states the people of Israel what they need are fighting back against the pro-pagan Dar and their manipulation of the people, which is heavily ongoing in Israel at the moment. And the lawyer is concerned the Israelis are being subjected to vaccines by fear, and is concerned that what happened in Germany is now happening in Israel. The truth is, it is being done by the same people or entities is why, and the operators of the programs are not German or Jewish either. Now, the next four pieces are all tied together and all come under the banner of engineered crises to set up a war in the Middle East and across the boundaries between Europe and Russia. All of it because the Hebrew Anunnaki are losing their war and the people are not complying like they wished outside of their own country. Fascism, which is Zionism, is operating heavily in Israel now as they turn on their own people, just as we had forecasted. But crises is a funny word, given that the middle four letters contain ISIS. Another of their fake psychotic gods they worship, who even have their own rogue military group of the same name. Except it is not Islam it references, but the Israeli Secret Intelligence Service, ISIS. A US Coast Guard ship fired warning shots in the course of a close encounter with vessels from Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guards Navy in the Straits of Hormuz off Iran, a Pentagon spokesman burbled out. And he said earlier today a large group of the Iranian Navy fast boats conducted unsafe and unprofessional manoeuvres and failed to exercise due regard for the safety of US forces as required under international law, according to the Pentagon mouthpiece John Kirby. Now, Kirby said the 13 fast attack boats approached US vessels at high speed coming as close as 150 yards to 6 US Navy vessels that were escorting the guided missile submarine USS Georgia through the Straits of Hormuz. And he said the US Coast Guard cutter fired around 30 warning shots from a .50 caliber machine gun at the Iranian vessels after other warnings, including radio communication and horn blasts. And after the second round of shots, as the boat allegedly came closer to the US fleet, the Iranian vessels left the area. Now, the Iranian officials have not commented on the claims, but this is the latest encounter and is the second such incident with the Iranian ships reported by the US Navy in the last fortnight. 2 weeks? Well, it's always 2 weeks, isn't it? Now, late last month, the US Fifth Fleet said in a statement that Iranian vessels had come within 68 yards of the USS Fireboat patrol boat and another American ship in the Persian Gulf north of the Strait of Hormuz. So that's about 8 ships that's gone through there now. But it's funny how that very same incident was played out on the show called Designated Survivor, is it not? The exact same incident. Perhaps that show was a documentary, not popular entertainment. But this incident just about sums up the childlike foreign policies of this country and the Pentagon's juvenile attempts to start war, not for the benefit of this country, but their paymasters, the Israelis, who are abject psychopaths. The common sense clue for them was in the script. But having already banged the war drums against Iran, for no reason that is conducive to America, I might add, the clue was the US Navy were moving in the waters in the Strait of Hormuz, which is off the coast of Iran. Not off the coast of America. You were in their waters with your warships. Now, imagine if the Iranian Navy sailed into Norfolk, Virginia harbour with large warships. Would you all just say hi and welcome if Iran had previously threatened America? Of course not. Simple, adult-based decision is stay away from their waters. Then there is no hostilities. But the child-level thinking at the top of each country's leadership is utter staggering. And no wonder the world is in a mess with juvenile thinking so-called leaders. It's beyond pathetic. Clashes have broken out for the second consecutive night between Palestinians and the Israeli junta police in Jerusalem, with dozens reported injured. Protesters hurled stones at the police and lit fires at the Damascus Gate in the Old City, and officers responded by firing stun grenades and water cannons. Now, the Palestinian Red Crescent said that at least 80 Palestinians were injured and 14 were taken to hospital. The Israeli police said at least one officer was hurt. Now, it had followed days of simmering unrest over possible evictions of Palestinians from land being claimed by Jewish settlers. And on Friday, more than 200 Palestinians and at least 17 Israeli police were hurt in skirmishes near Al-Aqsa Mosque, medics and police said accordingly. Now, Jerusalem's Al-Aqsa Mosque complex is one of Islam's most revered sites, but its location is also the holiest site in Judaism, known as the Temple Mount. Where it means temple, it also means Masonic. But for those new, and we do have a lot of new listeners now, that is a total excuse. They don't have holy sites in that region. If there was holy sites for the quote-unquote Jewish, they would be in Asia, from whence they came. Now, the complex is a frequent flashpoint for violence, but Fridays was apparently amongst the worst in years. And the quartet of Middle East negotiators, the US, the EU, Russia, and the UN on Saturday, expressed deep concern over the spiralling violence. The US expressing concern? Seriously? The clowns that operate at the highest levels of this country are the same people funding and supporting this violence. Land grabs and genocide, and the UK's not much better either. And as for the UN being involved, they should have been disbanded entirely years ago as not fit for purpose, which the trustee had said she'd done a few years back, but apparently now is engaging the UN Security Council. But has anyone asked whether the UN has ever prevented a single war or stopped ongoing ones? Because the answer is zero. If the UN did their job, Israel would be back to their 1967 zones. In fact, they would go back to pre-1948 zones and not exist as a country at all, because it never existed previously, and then not taken over every country in the region with impunity. Now, earlier on Saturday, Israeli police had stopped dozens of buses carrying worshippers to the mosque, and a number of Palestinians were arrested after the violence on Friday. They do not want us to pray. There is a fight every day. Every day there are clashes. Every day there are troubles, according to Mahmoud al-Marbouh. They were stopping worshippers going to their holy site. Imagine what would happen if the Muslims prevented Jews from praying at the Wailing Wall. Can you imagine what would happen? Global outcry. Well, what makes this act any different is the big question. Now, Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, said his country was acting responsibly. Pull the other one, it's got balls on, Mr. Netanyahu. To ensure law and order while maintaining freedom of worship. Well, clearly that was not taking place. Prime Minister can't uphold the law himself, never mind outside of himself, given the series of crimes he's been charged with. And the Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas condemned what he said were Israel's sinful attacks. Sinful indeed. But not content with causing disturbances in their own country or region, they caused it in another country this week, predictably Iran. A large fire has erupted at a chemical plant in the Iranian city of Qazvin, with local media reporting an explosion. And the incident follows an overnight blaze at the port city of Bushehr, home to Iran's only nuclear power plant. and the fire broke out at the plant on Saturday afternoon following a small explosion at the site. Now, footage circulating online shows flames emerging from the facility with a large column of billowing black smoke. Multiple fire engines were deployed to the location to tackle the blaze. Now, thankfully, the explosion and the fire that followed did not inflict any casualties, but at least 2 firefighters were injured while battling the flames. I do not need to tell our listeners who was likely involved in both events. But it didn't end there, sadly, as the racist, genocidal maniacs operating under the banner of Jewishism rolled on with their killing sprees throughout the week. 20 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli airstrikes, including 9 children, according to Gaza's Ministry of Health, after rockets fired from the territory towards Jerusalem were reportedly met with Israeli counterstrikes. Not quite. And some of the scores injured were also treated at the Beit Hanun hospital in the north of Gaza, and graphic images shared online purported to show injured people in Gaza being taken away by medical workers. An Israeli citizen was also injured by an anti-tank missile fired from Gaza and taken to a hospital for treatment, according to the IDF. Now, as usual, the lying Hebrew Anunnaki media reported only about rocket attacks by Hamas. Except the media en masse left one key portion of truth out of their narrative. The rockets were fired in response to the deaths of the Palestinians, not before. In response to. Now, earlier that day, Hamas claimed responsibility for Monday's rocket attacks on Jerusalem in what they claimed was a response to Israeli violence, including the eviction of Palestinian families and clashes at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Here is a really positive report out of the Middle East, and kudos to all who took part in it. The art of the people coming together to fight a common enemy that is not each other. Now, tens of thousands of Muslims in Iran and across the Middle East took part in Friday's International Quds Day protests, an annual Iran-backed campaign of demonstrations meant to show solidarity with the Palestinians. Iranian Jewish leaders have joined in the protests, calling on Jews, Muslims and Christians alike to stand against Zionism. Younes Hamami Lelazar, one of Iran's top rabbis, has expressed his support for the International Quds Day, which is also known as Jerusalem Day, and accused Israel's leaders of exploiting the ancient religion of Judaism in pursuit of their own goals. Zionists have been exploiting Judaism to achieve their own goals, he said on Saturday, and they've used Judaism, which is a monotheistic religion, as a pretext to justify within their own political framework any strategy to achieve their goal. Correct. And this behaviour was not accepted at all by the Jews of the world, he said, and from the very beginning of the Zionist regime until today, there has been a lot of opposition to the Zionists' approach, and it still continues. Mr. Lal Azar stressed that religious Jews find the brutal behaviours and crimes of the Zionist regime completely unacceptable and have taken part in campaigns against it, including Jerusalem Day. Now, Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei called Israel a terrorist garrison and said that it was a collective responsibility for people to fight against this regime. Now, in 2016, it showed that Iran was home to about 9,800 Jews, making theirs the largest community of Jews in the Middle East outside of Israel itself. But before 1979, over 100,000 Jews lived in Iran, with many fleeing the country for Israel in the aftermath of the Islamic Revolution, only to suffer discrimination in their new home country. Only to suffer discrimination in their new home country. Really? Discrimination in their alleged home country? And this supports what we've been saying all along. These Zionists, or Hebrew Anunnaki, care not one iota for the Jewish people in all their various castes. Now, Jews have lived in Iran for over 2,700 years, with multiple books in the Bible referencing the way of life in ancient Persia. And in 537 BC, after freeing Jewish slaves from the Babylonians, the Persian king Cyrus the Great allowed those who wanted to return to their homes in ancient Judea, while those who chose to remain were granted citizenship and allowed to rebuild their religious shrines or temples in Persia itself. Now, it was said Jews were able to maintain significant religious and economic freedoms after the Islamic conquest of Persia in the 7th century. Emperor Cyrus the Great of Persia permitted the Hebrews to return to the Holy Land and rebuild God's temple. Let's break that down, shall we? Who did Israel crown with a coin with his face labeling him Cyrus? Who moved the embassy to Jerusalem to prepare for God's temple, which is a sacrifice center unto the god Lucifer? The answer? Donald J. Trump. One look at the picture of Cyrus tells you he was A, not from here, and B, given the wings, one of the Anunnaki. Would you like further proof of that? Well, here it is. One of the few surviving sources of information that can be dated directly to Cyrus's time is the Cyrus Cylinder, a document in the form of a clay cylinder inscribed in Akkadian cuneiform. And it had been placed in the foundations of the Esagila, which is the temple of Marduk in Babylon, as a foundation deposit following the Persian conquest in 539 BC. Now, it was discovered in 1879 and is kept today in the British Museum in London. Now, the text of the cylinder denounces the deposed Babylonian king Nabonidus as impious and portrays Cyrus as pleasing to the chief god, yes, Marduk.